All right, we're doing a quick sound check to make sure everything works fine. Can I have a confirmation from my colleagues in Budapest and then from Jesse in the room? All good? Very good. I got a positive sign and it seems it's working all over. So warm welcome to everyone to this wonderful new EPSO competition system. My name is Andras Baneth. This is a live broadcast from Brussels. And I have the pleasure to welcome Ticiana with me, who is joining us from Portugal. Can you say hi? Make sure that the audio works fine.
Yeah, hello everyone and welcome for that session with us.
Wonderful. All right, thank you so much. So with that, we're going to get started and we're going to spend the next 1 hour discussing the brand new 2023 EPSO system, which is one of the biggest overhaul of the existing selection system for future EU officials since 2010. So with that, I'm going to cover a lot of ground and highlight all the changes, also talk about what has remained relatively the same, and then we're going to talk about a few practical questions and many things related to your preparation and how you can make the most out of it to get an EU job. So with that, we do a quick sound check. This is already done. And why don't you get familiar with the chat box, which in most systems, it's going to be at the bottom right corner. Why don't you type there where you are joining us from? And I probably won't be able to see all the incoming messages, but I presume that it's really from all over Europe, perhaps even beyond, from different parts of the world. We are very grateful that you are with us and that you have such an interest in this topic of EU careers and the changes that are about to happen. So thank you so much. I can see many answers coming in. That's wonderful. You're familiar with that. And part of the reason I encourage you to do that is to ask questions throughout. I'll cover a lot of things in the next roughly 1 hour, and perhaps many of the questions that come in will be covered at one point. But whatever may not be answered today, we're going to follow up in a memo or some other form to make sure that no question is left unanswered. I also have here my phone, my secondary device, and Rita and Agi in Budapest, they are kind enough to support me from a distance, and they're going to be screening the questions and feeding some of them to me so I can answer some of these live. So with that, let's going to get started. And you might know yours truly. I've been dealing with EPSO exams and EU careers for over a decade. And then Ticiana, maybe you want to say hi, maybe 2 words about yourself to introduce yourself, and then we're going to get on with the webinar. Ticiana.
Yeah, sure. So everyone, hello. I've been working with those assessment centers for a long time. And for selection, actually, sorry, I mentioned assessment center, but Andras is going to say something about this specific word, right, Andras, during our session today. But I am an HR specialist focused on recruitment and selection and development, so career and professional coach. And I'm super happy to be here with you today, trying to know everyone to understand this new selection procedure within EPSO. So it's a good opportunity. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So with that, let's get on. A few words about our company. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but those of you who may not be familiar with our work and the services, we've got a really incredible community over the many years we've been in business who've dealt with EU careers, who've succeeded in passing the selection tests and ultimately landing an EU job. And there's a very vibrant community as well on Facebook. If you are there on that platform, please join that. Not only the main page linked to us as EU training, but also the communities, the groups which are dedicated to specific competitions that are happening right now, and for future competitions there are going to be new dedicated groups as well. With that, we are present on social media, so follow us, get in touch with us. We are happy to offer a large number, or actually a huge number of tests, practice tests, in all fields that I'm going to cover today that are relevant to the competition, and not only in English, but in 24 official languages of the EU when it comes to verbal reasoning specifically. So with that, We also offer a large number of webinars. This is like a free info session, but we have many training workshop style webinars on abstract reasoning, on numerical reasoning, on different aspects of the competition. Those are either free, and there are many that are premium because there's a deep dive into the nuts and bolts of those particular tests. With that, we're going to offer or give a special exclusive offer for those of you who are persistent enough to stay until the end of this webinar. And that special discount code is only going to be valid for 48 hours. So perhaps that's another incentive aside from the substance of today's webinar to stay on and make sure that you follow everything that I'm covering. So with that, one word of disclaimer. We are a private company. We are not affiliated with EPSO. We have no connection to EPSO whatsoever. So we are doing our very best to offer you the most accurate and up-to-date information based on our understanding at this moment. But we're not the official representative. So whatever information I tell you, again, I'm doing my best to make sure that it's accurate and precise, but this is not the official information. So if you really want the official information, EPSO, the European Personnel Selection Office, and the European institutions are the go-to source for that kind of information. We will always give you updates. We're always going to tell you whatever information has landed in our virtual or physical inbox and then share it back with the community. But it's the notice of competition and EPSO's official website that is the authentic source. So with that out of the way, let's look at the new EPSO system. And the new model was actually adopted very recently, about 2 weeks ago on the 31st of January, after long discussions and many attempts of agreeing between the various EU institutions which have entrusted EPSO to help with the selection of their future civil servants. Having made that decision about the reform of the system, there it's going to be some finer points are still being finalized in the coming days or weeks, but pretty much the core and the skeleton, or more than a skeleton, the whole substance is already known, and this is what I'm presenting to you right now. But again, some finer points are still up in the air, and they may not have been fully decided as of the moment of this webinar on the 15th of February 2023. Now, for ongoing competitions, so those of you who may be already enrolled in competitions right now, you are not going to be subjected to these changes. Those of you who are candidates in ongoing competitions, you will follow the same rules or the same procedures that have been communicated to you at the moment of your application. So there's no change for those that are in progress. And because of that reason, there's going to be a bit of parallel, a bit of duality in the system, to the degree that existing competitions or ongoing competitions are running according to the current system, but the new ones that are to be announced, presumably from May onwards, are going to be according to the new system. Even the new system is going to be fine-tuned as we go along. This is our understanding, because it's a new system, so it might need certain minor adjustments as EPSO and the selection boards gather experience from candidates and just the way it's being run. With that, in summary about this new system, which I'm going to take a deep dive and look at all the nuts and bolts, all the details of it. But to a large degree, it's very similar to the system that existed before 2010. Those of you who have been around that long, where the abstract verbal numerical reasoning were there. There was no assessment center prior to 2010, and there were EU knowledge tests, which again is coming back in some competitions, something that I'm going to discuss in a moment. And then also it's a bit similar to the way temporary agents are selected, where it's a lot of, let's say, classic selection, as you might know from the private sector, where your profile, your background is extremely important, and then certain interviews may play a role in the final stages of the selection. So it's a bit of a mix of these two, but we're going to see how EPSO has changed the system to streamline it and to benefit candidates in terms of the timing, in terms of the complexity, and in terms of the attractiveness of working for EU institutions. What are the main elements? So the main elements are the ones I'm going to present in a moment. So you have basically a one-phase competition. What does it mean? That you're going to take the selection tests in one sitting. That doesn't mean that all candidates are going to be taking the exam at the same time. What it means is that after you book a date for your competition, you're basically going to go through different exams in a single, not even a single day, but in a couple of hours in one go. So it's not going to be fragmented into different parts. Again, at least this is the plan. At least this is the idea, that you will not need to book different dates for different components of the exam. And not only that, there's no more pre-selection, no more assessment center. There's one phase. So there's a single selection block that you need to succeed in. Number two, no more assessment center, but I put a little asterisk there because there's a bit more to it. So the term assessment center is probably going to cease to exist because it's not part of that selection phase that I have just described. Having said that, I pass the floor to Ticiana to say a few words why there is a sort of assessment center without that being an assessment center.
Yes, and I already gave that hint to all of you when I presented myself, okay, as me being an HR specialist. So it's not really an assessment center, but still the oral tests that currently they use in their assessment center, you will face them, you can face them on the recruitment phase, okay? And when I say recruitment phase, I mean after the selection procedure that Andras just mentioned in one shot, in one go, okay? They would have their reserve list. And from that reserve list, there will be the recruitment phase that the DGs, okay, and institutions will do by themselves. And probably Andras will go into cover this with more details. And when you go for the recruitment phase, the interviews might be there, okay, which are now today called the assessment center and the oral tests that we know as competence-based interview, situational competence-based interview, as well motivation interview, and maybe oral presentation. So those might be checked on the recruitment phase.
Very good. Thank you, Ticiana. And that's a point we're going to come back to. First of all, two comments there. We can still talk about a single selection process, right? And the word selection is really important because that's what EPSO does, European Personnel Selection Office. And Ticiana already mentioned the other key term, which is recruitment, right? Recruitment is different from selection because selection results in a reserve list from which a person can be recruited. And that's why the assessment center is no longer part of that selection part, but there could be candidates or laureates, as they are called at that stage. They could be subjected to additional evaluation. And that's exactly what we just heard, what those might be, which are very much modeled on the current assessment center, with a major difference being that these are going to be optional. So the institutions and the directors general, they are free to decide whether or not they want these further evaluations of the successful laureates from the reservists. So let's go on. And again, if you have questions, feel free to put that in the chat box. I'm happy to come back to it, but that's going to be recurring. So as we are putting the pieces of the puzzle together. So with that, the competition itself, the single phase competition, that's going to be the new normal. It's only going to be based on written or computer-based tests. So there's no oral interviews, presentations, any of that kind, which is part of the selection system. The competition, you can pass a competition without saying a single word. So you will be required to sit various tests, and we're going to look at what those are, but everything is in writing or on a computer, but you don't need to speak, at least not in the selection part. Now, moving on, the selection cycle is going to be much faster, and that's probably good news for many candidates. It was one of the #1 goals or objectives that EPSO wanted to achieve by changing the system. They wanted to make sure that a candidate who's interested in an EU career will be able to pass these competitions and get into a job much faster. Given the way the world works today, the job market operates, it has to be quicker. So the idea is to have from A to Z, from beginning to end, about 4 to 6 months, from the moment the competition is announced until the reservist is pulled up, or perhaps even the moment of actual recruitment, you being offered a job at one of the EU institutions. Going on, if I could just read my slide, so the regular competition, so there's going to be more regularity. There's going to be quite often, and again, subject to a reality check, but the idea is to have more regular competitions, though the emphasis is probably going to be on specialist competitions, but the idea is to have generalist competitions as well, mostly for administrators, so AD kind of jobs. For AST, so for assistants, that is probably still going to be decided. Now, the point is that given the fast-moving pace of the competitions, it's going to be a more dynamic system and going to correspond better to what needs the institutions have. And then the institutions and the different DGs, directors general in the Parliament, Commission, or other institutions, have a bit more flexibility, a bit more autonomy in the end. So just as we heard, the selection itself is standardized, is centralized by EPSO, but then when it comes to picking candidates from the reservist, there's going to be more flexibility that the institutions can say. Like if they want to subject you to another competency-based interview or mini competency-based interview, because it's not a selection anymore, but evaluation, assessment of sorts, they can, but it might be different for the commission, or even inside the commission. One DG may require you to go through an additional mini exam, while others may not. So that's a positive and a negative from a candidate perspective, because you may not fully know in advance what kind of additional exam you may be required to sit. Obviously, you will be told once you are on the reserve list what the requirement is, and we at EU Training are very happy to assist you in that. We're happy to help you in that preparation, and we're gathering information, or will be gathering information as we go along. But then again, it might be a bit more ad hoc, a bit less predictable of sorts, at least at the beginning. Now, this is our current understanding. We'll need to see whether more standardization is or guidelines may be brought in. We still need to see that, but the institutional flexibility translates into candidates needing to inform themselves or learn more of what specific preparation they might need to undertake in the very end. And then the next thing, EPSO has become or is becoming more of a service center. So our understanding is that it's no longer like the bouncer in the bar who says, okay, can you come in? And you don't come in. So really the gatekeeper. It's more of an intermediary between the candidates and the institutions, which kind of changes a little bit the role or the position of EPSO, at least the way we see it from the outside, that it selects candidates, it tells or helps the institutions to decide whether someone has an overall or baseline suitability to become a civil servant with the European Union. But then beyond that point, the institutions themselves can bring in their unique preferences, perspectives, and requirements that they want the candidates to meet. So that's pretty much the idea. And again, it's just maybe a more theoretical thing, but it translates into practice in a way that EPSO is now as much serving the institutions as it's kind of serving, helping, evaluating, assessing the candidates. So it's this intermediary between these two constituents. So as a final point, and it's very important for practical intents and purposes, is that remote testing is going to be the norm. Many of you may know or have seen or have taken tests in test centers, whether in Brussels, whether around the world. That's going to be phased out. Everything is going to happen on your computer. And that is a bit of a tricky thing, whether you have the equipment, whether you can install the right software, whether you have a silent space that you can use. As a side note, the very venue where I'm broadcasting this from, we offer a studio, a fully equipped studio for candidates. So if you need a silent space, that's my little plug, my little pitch, that you are welcome to use our facilities. But having said that, remote testing is going to be the norm, and with your own equipment, obviously a lot of safeguards and testing and making sure that there's no parallel software running or someone helping you pass the tests by using certain tools that may not be permitted. So there are a lot of rules and safeguards around it, but you will no longer need to actually go to a certain place as long as you are ready to take the tests on your own device. So these are the core elements, but perhaps more importantly, we need to look at how the candidates are going to be tested. Before I go there, Ticiana, I don't know if you want to say something, and I take a quick look because many questions are coming in. So first Ticiana, and then some questions I'll pick and choose.
Yes, what we could understand from EPSO is that now the process, it's a different process, okay, in their perspective, and we see that indeed it is quicker, leaner, and more accessible. Okay, because they will be sharing with the candidates the sources for the EU knowledge tests and also for the field tests, okay, the MCQ in the field. So that will help from the candidate's perspective, from your perspective, it will be super useful and helpful for you to really guide your preparation and focus your preparation on those content that nowadays they are preparing. So that's also an information that we know that they are preparing those tests at the moment, and who are those people preparing those tests? Are the people that work already for the institutions in those specific fields, okay? And once they have all those tests prepared, they will share as well the sources so that the candidates can really focus on while they are preparing. So I would like just to focus on that. And considering the computer that you mentioned, so for the remote test, in an overall way. So what they mention is that this will be, you can you just going to do the test from your personal computer, okay? Not from the company or from a corporate computer, because there might be some firewalls there that, they cannot really check your computer. So, just be prepared for that, because this can happen when you go for your test.
Very good. Thanks so much. Let me just pick two questions, which I think are pretty important and relevant. And I know that there are many other coming in. Hopefully I'll answer most of them as we go along. And again, those that I will not have time for, we're going to come back and prepare answers in writing. So the first one is it possible to lose the laureate position if you do bad on the assessment center? So again, the term assessment center is probably going to cease to exist in that current form. But the question relates to those additional interviews or additional exams or tests or evaluations, whatever they will be called. Whether you do bad, can you lose your laureate position on the reserve list? And the answer is no. Once you are on the reserve list, you are on the reserve list. That's a given. No one can take that away from you. But here comes the second question I picked, which says, do you think there will be more people accepted to the reserve list and less possibility to get hired? And I think that is a key concern. In all honesty and transparency, that is our key concern, and probably for many candidates is going to be a key concern. There are two considerations here. One is the stated aim of the new system is to have a bit more people on the reserve list, because the tests and the exams that you need to sit are kind of inevitably lead to a somewhat bigger reserve list, because that is what's going to give more flexibility to the institutions to still select or choose or evaluate certain candidates from the list. So that is one consideration. But there's the other one, which is a very practical, mundane one, that everybody works with budgets. EPSO works with budgets. They cannot really afford to put so many people through the entire exam system and then ultimately have a reserve list which is so inflated or bloated that a huge number of candidates are not going to get hired. And it's not just the budgets, but it's also your very own expectation. Because you are sitting these tests, you're preparing, you're putting a lot of effort and time into the preparation and then sitting the exam. You get on the reserve list, certainly you have a clear expectation to be hired in the end. So again, one of the stated goals of EPSO is to make EU jobs more attractive. Now, having a huge reserve list from which not many candidates get hired is certainly not going to achieve that goal. So you see that these two countering kind of powers or forces, and that needs to be a certain balance. And it is to be seen. So I don't expect that they're going to do huge reserve lists and a large number of candidates are not getting hired. Perhaps the question is when you are getting hired and how you are going to convince an institution to hire you. And that is why those additional tests are becoming more important, because even if they are not part of the actual selection, they will be quite important in you landing a job. And then number two is perhaps the right motivation letter, the right CV, the right kind of lobbying might be necessary to be invited by the institutions from the reserve list. So again, I can't give you any more specific answer than that. We need to see how it develops. And perhaps a final point that I hinted at, it might take a bit more time for certain candidates to be hired from the reserve list, because again, creating a reserve list takes a lot of effort on all sides, both the candidates and EPSO. So once there are many candidates on the reserve list, it's in pretty much everyone's interest that ultimately a large number, perhaps a majority of those candidates be hired at one point. So maybe that's going to happen quite early, maybe a couple months in, perhaps it might spread out. But then again, the candidate expectations that once you're on the reserve list and it takes a year to be hired, that's probably not ideal for anyone. And your life situation may change and you may not even be available or willing to accept that job offer. So you see that there are competing priorities there, and we need to see the size of those reserve lists, how that's going to impact the actual recruitment. So with that, let's go on. How candidates are going to be tested. Probably that's the most practical and actionable part of this presentation. Well, we talked about the actual competition, but we need to speak about the pre-competition phase. So that what happens before you sit in front of your computer screen and with a Red Bull or a herbal tea, you focus and take those tests. What happens is that there's this pre-selection or pre-competition, and excuse my language, I'm still using the old terminology, pre-selection. There is no more pre-selection. So pre-competition phase. Short-term planning of exams, so it's a pretty agile, quick-moving thing that the institutions say, hey, we need new staff, that many people we are planning to hire eventually, so please EPSO, we'd like to ask you to run a competition. So there is a quick, perhaps quicker planning of those competitions. And then there is it's pretty much, it's a demand-driven thing. It's not that EPSO's director general is going to wake up one morning and say, oh, why don't we run a new competition? Obviously, it all comes as a demand from the institutions who map out their personal needs. They look at retirement rates, they look at employee turnover, they look at a lot of factors, budgets, obviously, and say, this is what we're planning or wishing to have as new staff, and then they give that assignment in the form of a competition to EPSO. And then the actual competition phase is perhaps the most relevant to you. What kind of tests are required? And many of you may have already seen some of the stuff we put out there, but let me give you a quick summary. There is certainly a publication of a notice of competition, just like right now. That's the official source of information. Then there's a self-assessment. So you need to go on EPSO's website and kind of self-evaluate, make sure that, okay, am I suitable for this? Do I have the motivation? This is not really an eliminatory test in any sense, but perhaps it eliminates or takes out a few candidates who are not too much into it, who are not too motivated, or perhaps don't have the right profile or qualifications or background or citizenship. And then there's this so-called experience profiling instrument. This is not a talent screener. This is more of an internal tool to EPSO to see, okay, does this person, based on everything, all the CV and profile information that they've provided, do they kind of match the right criteria? Because if you are obviously not qualified for a certain position, or you don't have the certain number of years of work experience that they require, so if there's an obvious red flag, this is probably going to literally flag your profile and to say, okay, this person doesn't seem to be meeting the objective formal criteria. And then there is a selection ranking in the sense that, let me just come back to that. So selection ranking, which is going to happen on the basis of the tests, on the basis of the exams that you'll be subjected to. And I'll go into more detail in a moment, but that's where the true concours, the French word, competition comes in, where you compete with other candidates and you need to sit certain tests. And then there's an eligibility check, making sure in the very end that those who have passed those tests meet the requirements. And then eventually there is a reserve list. So all of this is pretty straightforward, pretty streamlined, I would say. And again, not that radically different from the current system, but certain loose ends or certain permutations were cut off, and it's just channeled into a faster and more dynamic system. So what are the tests? The tests are pretty classic with one or two exceptions. So they keep the abstract verbal numerical reasoning test, the so-called psychometric tests, often referred to as CBT, computer-based tests. So these CBTs, these abstract verbal numerical reasoning tests, they stay with an important change that they will only be pass or fail. And probably 50% will be the pass-fail mark. We haven't heard any information, and it might be because there's no such information yet decided, whether you need to have 50% on each one of these, or as we have seen in past competitions, they might combine the abstract and the numerical scores, and then the verbal would be separate. This is something we need to see. I'm working with the assumption that you need to pass 50% on each of these three, but then again, we will see when the first notice of competition comes out, or perhaps earlier, we might hear something about this. Number two, you have the digital literacy tests, right? The digital literacy test or digital skills test, it goes by different names, at least at this point. This is a new test. So this is a new kind of thing, which is about, as the name suggests, your competencies, or perhaps I would say knowledge of working with digital tools. So I have a couple more information about this that I will come back to in a moment. And then comes number three. There is a distinction between generalist competitions, and generalist typically means that you can apply with any kind of diploma, no matter what you have studied. And then there are specialists, which usually have a set frame or a set number or a set kind of degrees that they accept that you must have. So specialists could be nuclear scientists, it could be competition lawyers, it could be macroeconomists, it could be migration experts. There could be many types of specialists. The generalist, as the name suggests, is quite open and broad. Now, for generalist competitions, they will reintroduce EU knowledge exams. So that's why I said it's a bit similar to the pre-2010, where they used to have that. You need to know how the EU works. They will give out, so they disclose information about the sources from which they create the test, just like Ticiana mentioned earlier, which is good news. So you at least have a certain, perhaps a bit more limited scope. It's not just, okay, learn about the EU. Well, good luck with that. It's vast, right? So this is probably going to focus on procedures, decision-making, perhaps a bit of history, key EU policies and policy priorities, and then institutions and how they operate, how they work. Roughly, that's kind of the very broad scope, which again is still a huge area. But once we see the sources from which they create those multiple choice tests, that will make it a bit more concrete and a bit more bite-sized that you can eventually learn about. And then the specialist will have multiple choice knowledge tests. So these will be closely related to the field of the given exam, whether it's economists, whether it's intellectual property experts, whatever it may be. These are going to be dedicated specialist knowledge-based multiple choice tests. And this is going to be ranked. So you not only need to know this, but you need to know it pretty well. Depending on the number of candidates, which tend to be fairly large, and especially for the generalist competitions tend to be very large, you need to know the EU stuff very well. It's not enough to get just 50% of the points. You need to be among the top candidates because it's going to be a ranking criterion. And then there's a written test case study, which it's not either or, but a written test in the form of a case study. At least this is our current understanding. So it's going to be a written assignment. And again, this is where we are a bit in the gray area of how exactly this is going to work. Our assumption is that it's going to work pretty similarly to the existing case study, meaning that there are background documents that you need to read and process and then draft perhaps a memo or a little essay or a little briefing based on that information. Importantly, this is not a knowledge test. So this is not going to require you to demonstrate how much you know about a certain topic. This is about your skills and competencies. And they already specify that there are 3 or 4 competencies that are going to be tested through this particular exam. And this is also ranked. Now, this is not automated. This is not a multiple choice one. This is really about writing. So someone, or usually 2 persons, need to evaluate what you've written and then give you a certain point or score. So that is going to be another ranking factor in those in the ensemble, in this exam cohort. Just to recap, you have the abstract verbal numerical reasoning, pass or fail. Some competitions, and it's not yet decided which ones or based on which criteria, but some competitions will have the digital literacy skills, probably also pass or fail. So that's somewhat of an easy hurdle, it seems, but just like with easy hurdles, you don't want to fail there. You want to be absolutely sure that you jump over those hurdles. And then come the 2 ranking tests, either EU knowledge or field-specific knowledge, and the written test, which is in the form of a case study, most likely, right? So basically you have kind of these 4 components depending on what kind of competition you're sitting, with some variations possible, but these are the building blocks of any EPSO competition as of May 2023. Right, so before I look at the written test case study, Ticiana, if you have any comments to say or anything that I may have missed and you're aware of, and then I take a quick look at the incoming questions.
Yes, I would like to mention about the written test, okay, the case study that you just said, because it is connected with the behavioral competences, the new framework that they shared last year in October, where they share, that now they have still 8 competencies, but with a different perspective, okay? So in that specific exam, the case study, as Andras mentioned, not related to the field, but related to the behavioral competencies, they might be assessing you on 4 core main competencies, which is critical thinking, analyzing and creative problem solving, decision making and getting results, entrepreneurship, okay, and communication. So they shared, that information about the case studies, that mainly those exams will be assessing those 4 core competencies. When what I want to call your attention, that there are more competencies as well for them to assess. From those 8 competencies, one of them, it's called information management, which is digital and data literacy, that might be assessed on this digital skill test that Andras mentioned. And the other ones, learning as a skill and working together, where are they? Probably in the oral tests, when we have the recruiting phase, that they will be doing like interviews with the oral tests, as we previously mentioned. But in our assumption, those competencies, working together and learning as a skill, will be assessed there in those oral tests. I just want to make that remark.
Very good. Thank you so much. And from the corner of my eye, I see entrepreneurship. What? That question. And that's a legitimate question of what the hell is entrepreneurship. Now, 2 quick comments. One is entrepreneurship is broadly translated into leadership, in the sense not of people management, but in terms of proactivity, taking initiative, taking ownership and responsibility for something that you do internally inside the organization. So this is not about launching a business inside the commission, but it's about, again, taking initiative and taking the lead on certain projects. Good news is we have a very comprehensive description of all these competencies on our website, and you can find that with analysis, and it's completely free to download. It's on the ebook section, so why don't you check it out, and perhaps Rita or Agi could put that into the chat box so you can immediately take a look. Don't go away and download it now, do it after the webinar. Yeah. With that, I have 3 questions that I want to address that I see came in, and I find these pretty relevant for most of you. The first one is, how much time does it take between the publication of the competition and the actual test? Having said what I just described, that they want to speed up and streamline the process, it sometimes took quite a while between the publication and the actual test. The idea in the new system is that indeed it goes perhaps even less than 3 months, perhaps even 2 months, perhaps a couple of weeks. But then, having seen over the many years how new processes and new systems are put in place, I think at the beginning, don't get your hopes up too much, especially because of the complexities of remote testing. So I think it's a very technically complex thing to make sure that there is equal access of all candidates to these tests. Obviously, if you don't have a computer, that might be a tricky situation that you need to borrow one from someone. Again, equal access to the test and equal opportunities for everyone. And then technologically, to make sure that the remote testing is secure, that the internet doesn't drop, and what happens if there is a connection problem, and all those things that go with the online world. So until they put that into place, it might take a while. But then again, perhaps after a couple of months, or when the system is already functioning smoothly, it will probably be a couple of weeks from the publication or at the end of the application. So when the application deadline passes, from that moment until you are invited to sit an exam, or when you pick a date for your exam. Another question, do you expect there will be implicit geographical nationality limitations about who gets on the reserve list? And the answer is no, because EPSO basically doesn't, I wouldn't say doesn't care, that's not the right way. It's irrelevant for EPSO to a certain degree who gets on the reserve list from a nationality perspective. It's extremely important for all member states, right? Like if you're coming from, I don't know, Portugal or Latvia or Finland, whichever member state would want to encourage their citizens to apply for these exams and encourage them and have kind of maximize the number of opportunities. Certainly that's a keen interest for most member states. But from EPSO's perspective, they're not going to pick and choose anyone on the basis of nationality. Where it becomes more important is at the moment of recruitment, because the institutions, they need to observe by the staff regulations a broad geographical balance between among EU staff, somewhat proportionate to the size of the member state or population of a member state among the EU 27. And that's a very tricky thing, because you might say, well, we have, I don't know, 500 people at the institutions as assistants, or another country say, well, we don't have many assistants, but we have 2 directors general. So how do you compare not just the sheer number of citizens working for the institutions, but the seniority, the level of positions, the kind of positions they have becomes a pretty tricky thing. But then again, that's at the recruitment phase. Once you're in the reservist, it doesn't concern the exams themselves. And then a final point before I move on, for the EU knowledge part, do you think they will reuse certain questions that they were using for the CAST exams? The CAST is the contract agent selection tests. So the contract agent exams, which already include this kind of knowledge test that they're going to put forward in the EPSO one. Whether they reuse the same database, I have no idea. I really don't know whether that's going to happen or not, whether the level, how detailed that is, or the complexity compares to it, and they say, yeah, take that database and use it. They might, but there are certain other areas which do not exist in the contract agent selection tests, but those are going to be launched as EPSO competitions, such as migration and or internal security. As far as I can tell, there's no such CAST profile, so presumably they don't have such tests anyways. So yeah, we need to see. But when it comes to the EU knowledge, there is already actually an EU knowledge test requirement for internal competitions that are happening now at the European Commission. So that database or that question batch may be reused indeed for the mainstream generalist EPSO competitions. Okay, so just a quick recap of what Ticiana has described with the written test. So competency-based, it's not knowledge-based. Presumably there will be background documents so they can evaluate your analytical skills and your drafting skills and many of the things we heard. Actually, these are on the screen right now that Ticiana mentioned. So the critical thinking, analyzing, the decision-making, the entrepreneurship, and certainly the communication skill or written communication skills. And then it's computer-based and remotely run. So that's pretty much a quick recap of the case study. A few words about the digital skills test or digital literacy test. What in the world is that? So we have some information about that already. It's actually, there are 5 kind of building blocks of what these tests are supposed to cover, which knowledge, information, competency they are supposed to cover. First one is information and data literacy. So how do you understand, again, information processing, mostly in the digital world, and then the data literacy. So if you are presented with perhaps a complex set of data, and how do you make sense of it, or what tools could you use to decode that data? Now, certainly you don't need to be a programmer, and this is not numerical reasoning. This is really about applied digital skills. Then there's the communication and collaboration, the various messaging apps or project management and any other tool that you are probably using to a large degree already in your day-to-day digital life. And then there are questions about these and what are the best practices, what are the caveats, what are the dangers of it. Digital content creation. So when you are required to format, craft a document or some creative piece, softwares that you can use and their practical application. Then there is a security part, so IT security or computer security or kind of basic internet security, what to be aware of, what's a malware, what about, I don't know, third-party unauthorized access, certain key concepts which you would most likely have heard or be familiar with, but it's required that you pass this in a multiple choice format and you answer the right, you pick the right answers. Problem solving, and again, this is not in any other context than the digital world and digital literacy. So to say, well, if your computer doesn't boot up, what are you going to do? You know, you plug in the wire and you call help desk, but perhaps a bit more complex than that. How do you find a way around computer or digital related issue? So these are the kind of building blocks, and we are already looking at this very closely, and we're going to be offering practice tests as well. But EPSO itself is currently waiting for those tests to be authored. So again, they themselves may not be 100% familiar what these tests are going to include, though certainly they have far more specific ideas than what they have communicated publicly at this point. So yeah, just a recap, this doesn't exist currently. Just as I said, it's brand new, and it's let me see, not universal. So it's not that every competition is going to include this kind of test. It will be known at the moment of notice of competition whether this particular test is required as part of that competition or not. And then you have the language part. It's English only, given that all software in the institution runs in English, or at least that's like the default language. So the test will be in English. And then you have somewhat different levels for administrators and assistants. For administrators, some concepts may be asked about. So I don't know, what's the dark web and what are some digital trends, versus the assistant, which may be more practical, more hands-on questions. So that's it. And then a few words about the non-existent assessment center, though we already covered a fair bit of a ground there, but just to recap that, and then I'll pass the floor again to Ticiana. So no more oral tests in the selection phase, right? Let's just emphasize that point. Oral tests, interview, competency-based interview, presentation, none of it is part of the actual selection block anymore, but those are pushed to the end and somewhat optional. As I said, because it's post-competition, so it's after the reserve list has been drawn up, and it's not part of the assessment center as a term. It's a term that may not even be used any longer. And then it could be specific or general, depending on the institution's preference, but obviously they serve a purpose. They do select in or select out certain candidates. So even if they're not called selecting, but there are certain evaluation, you want to demonstrate that you have those competencies, and to demonstrate that effectively, you probably need preparation. And this is my very self-serving pitch to tell you to use our services. But regardless of that, if you are perhaps not as confident in an interview setting, or you don't know how to structure what you want to present, or you are a bit unfamiliar with the way the institutions operate and the kind of corporate culture, if that's a term I could use for a public institution, and you want to speak the right language, that is something that requires preparation. And again, we put a lot of resources out there, ebooks and webinars and all the rest, but certainly we are available and happy to help. And then, as I said before, each institution may choose which kind of tests or evaluation they want to apply, or perhaps, and that's an interesting point, perhaps none at all. Perhaps they say, okay, here's a person on the reserve list, they're the best expert in the field, we're going to take that person, offer them a job. I think this is going to be the exception, but legally speaking, there's no obligation to subject anyone on the reserve list to further tests. They probably will, and most of them will most likely will, but legally speaking, there's no such obligation. And this is the kind of a la carte, the menu of the kind of evaluations or tests that they may require. And they may even involve EPSO to support these efforts. So it may not be EPSO per se that runs these evaluations, because EPSO is only involved to the point of the reserve list, but they may get certain assistance or help or professional kind of guidance to help run these further evaluations. And there could be personality tests, there could be role play, there could be a wide range of formats that they might apply. And then, generally speaking, because of everything we've discussed, written communication is probably the most important. So that's where the real selection happens. So perhaps that's something you really want to focus on. Ticiana, anything to add or whatever I may have missed?
No, I think you mentioned everything that they need to know by now. One concern that I see here in the questions, Andras, it's about the language 1 and language 2. Although you mentioned that the digital skill test would be in English because all the digital tools are in English within the institutions. I mean, people are asking about language 1 and language 2. And what I see from EPSO perspective is that there won't be any more language 1 and language 2. Okay, the terminology actually. Okay, they would be talking about proficiently. So the one that I'm really proficient, and the only one that I am stronger. Okay, so that's how they would be calling language 1 and language 2. Okay, so I just want to give that input here because I've been seeing people talking about language 1 and language 2, and those terminologies would not be used anymore. So just for you to know that you would have to choose from the one that you're proficient and the other one that you are really good at.
Yeah, that's super helpful because that's not a point I cover, at least in the slides. Again, the terminology is a bit changing, as we have seen with the assessment center, with the competition phase, because it's not selection or pre-selection or anything, but also with languages. Language 1, language 2 will not be used any longer, but a different way of describing these. Now, how, or let's say which language the competitions are going to be administered in, or in which language can you take the competitions, I think there is a bit of uncertainty there, at least on my side. So I don't want to say anything more than that. I may have missed that information, or that may have not reached me, but I'm not entirely sure how exactly they're going to tackle this very sensitive problem of language, of which language do you need to sit verbal reasoning in. My understanding is that this is still going to be possible in one of the 24 languages of the EU. So if your one language is Romanian and the other one is French, you're not going to be obliged to sit those tests in English. I don't think that would be workable. I don't think that would perhaps even be legal from a kind of a staff regulations and the equality of access and those kind of things. But the language is a delicate thing where English is rather dominant, but at the same time, French and German are working languages of the institutions. And then comes Spanish and Italian, the countries which have challenged many competitions over the years at the European Court of Justice for not having offered certain tests in those languages. So it's pretty delicate, and we need to see exactly how they're going to approach this or how they're going to cut through this Gordian knot. So with that, just to finish off, a couple of quick questions that we put together, but I see that a lot of questions are coming in at the same time. So will all 8 elements of the new competency framework be tested? Ticiana already mentioned it, that 3 or 4 will be tested in the written test case study, so in the exam itself. But the other 4, because there's an 8-element competency framework, may or may not be tested in the very end, so in the post-competition phase, when institutions may decide to run those additional evaluations. And again, there's no legal obligation for institutions or EPSO itself to test all 8 competencies. It's preferable, it's great, and they are kind of encouraging the future employers to evaluate those, but legally speaking, they don't need to, or they don't have to test all 8. Next one, which competencies will be tested by the case study? I think we already covered that, and there was this quick list of those 3 or 4 competencies that are tested. Next one, what's the best strategy, best preparation strategy for the new competition? Well, know the system, and that's what you're doing right now by listening to this webinar or reading the transcript, which is going to be made available. But number 2 is focusing on as much the learning, preparation, and then simulation. So we put that on the screen. No, actually, we didn't put that on the screen, but making a slight distinction between learning about EU knowledge, if you're sitting a generalist competition, or the specialist knowledge that you have given that competition. That's a learning process, right? Those are knowledge-based tests, and you need to know it as well as humanly possible. But then there are the psychometric tests, the abstract verbal numerical. You want to make sure that you're very much at ease and that it's absolutely not a risk that you might fail on those tests. So again, that's more of a practice and learning about methodology. And then comes the written communication, which is a bit more tricky because you want to write, you want to express yourself, you want to write the briefing and practice and put some time pressure. So that, again, is much more of a skill-based exam. So you need to focus, you need to understand what a given exam tests or evaluates to make sure that you are fully prepared. How many people will end up on the reserve list? We spoke about that earlier. I'm not going to go into any further detail. How many of them will be recruited? Again, somewhat of an open question, but I described all the considerations that go into it. Will the Court of Justice have any lawyer linguist tests? That was one of the points that the Court of Justice raised, because they want to have lawyer linguist tests. They want to have those linguistic tests to make sure that they can select the best candidates for those kind of positions. Chances are yes, so that might be kept. There might be a tiny bit of exception or exemption from the core rules. And then, can EU institutions still run internal competitions? And those of you who may be working at the institutions already as contract agents or temporary agents would certainly be very keen to hear this. And the answer is yes, they can run internal competitions, because by default, EPSO is not involved in those. EPSO might be called upon perhaps, but again, as a main rule, EPSO is not involved in the internal competitions of the Commission, Parliament, Court of Justice, Court of Auditors, etc. Will there be competitions that keep AD, AST, ASTC? Probably yes. So administrators, assistants, assistants, secretaries, those distinctions will probably be kept, and dedicated competitions will be launched for these profiles. And that's perhaps a big philosophical question. Is it a better system overall? And I guess it is. I can argue easily for both sides, like a good lawyer could. The positive side, certainly, that it's more streamlined. Presumably, it's going to be faster, fewer tests. You can do it all in one sitting. That's probably a plus. It's perhaps a bit more clear, the different phases. And then eventually, more people will end up on the reserve list. But then again, the argument against it is how many of them will be really recruited, how transparent or how standardized or how predictable are those additional evaluations or exams that you need to sit after you are on the reserve list. That's a big question mark at this stage, perhaps for everyone, not just for us, but to see how exactly that's going to play out in practice. So overall, probably a better system. And also the EU knowledge being brought in, or specific knowledge, generally is a positive aura around that, so that people who end up in the institutions will know more about the institutions. And then what are the pros and cons? I think this is what I just described. And certainly you have views. Certainly you have your opinion, your impressions. Share those with us. Please send us a message or put it on social media. Pass it on to us, because we're very interested to hear how you see this. Are you happy about this? Do you see risks? Are you unhappy? Share that, because we're very, very interested in hearing that feedback. And presumably also EPSO is pretty interested in that, because they want to see how it's being received. So do channel it back to us. Please let us know if you're happy, unhappy, or you see certain pain points or certain tricky elements in the system. Upcoming competitions, these are all fairly known and public, and I know we're reaching the end of our time, so I'm going to close it off in a moment. There are quite a few coming up. Most notably, in September, there is a generalist competition. This is a wonderful opportunity for all the reasons that I've stated. There hasn't been any generalist competition for probably 4 years, and perhaps I'm wrong, maybe even 5, but for many, many years now. And this is a great opportunity for anyone who is interested in a new career, and this is probably going to be a huge, huge, huge hit among many candidates and many interested people. So with that, just to close it off, take a look at our resources at the website. There are a lot of further ideas as to how to prepare, how to succeed, that you can use, you can read. We make it available as widely as possible. Many of these things I've already covered. Many of these things we've already looked at. And I still need to share with you the special unique special discount code before we close off today's webinar. And these tips, I mean, broadly, I've covered all of them. That's why I'm not spending any extra time on this. But to say that on eutraining.eu, you can find really a wealth of resources, preparation tools, tons of free webinars, some paid webinars, the digital literacy skills coming soon, and there's going to be a dedicated generalist category that we're putting out there. So we're trying to do our best to make all the resources as widely available as possible. Check those tests, 24 languages for the verbal reasoning, from Maltese to Lithuanian to all the perhaps less widely spoken languages. Those are all available. You can practice those. Tips and tricks and everything else. So with that, I leave the discount code on for a second or two. Ticiana, I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add in respect of our participants' valuable time before we finish up for today.
Yeah, I just want to thank all of them and say that we are also learning and adapting ourselves to this new way of selecting from EPSO, and also adapting ourselves to the new terminologies as well. So, but I would like to say that we are together, in the same journey, I would say. And please count on us. I'll be happy to help you. Okay, I mean, with the exams, and then with the oral exams as well. So you can really count on us. Thanks for your attention and your time.
By all means, I can absolutely reinforce that message that we are here to help you prepare. Certainly we're a business, but beyond that, we have a mission. And that mission is to help you achieve your dream and get an EU job and pursue an EU career. So we're putting all those tools out there that help you realize that dream. So with this discount code, it's valid for 48 hours. As of now, it's 2023 EPSO in all caps, and that gives you a wonderful 20% off all our products that you can find on the website. So if you're really dedicated and want to start preparing already in February for an exam that's coming in May or June or September, you're more than welcome, and I can only encourage you to do that because the competition is probably going to be rather fierce, and you need to be among the best to get on the reserve list and eventually land the job. So with that, thank you so much. We're really grateful for this amazing community and everyone who followed us online, or those who may be watching this as a recording. The transcript is going to be made available. The slides are going to be made available. Again, we did our very best to share everything that we know about this at this point in time, but the official information is with EPSO and the EU institutions. But we're going to be probably going to do a very similar event in a few weeks or a few months when new information comes to the surface and then the new exams are launched. Typically, I do a live event, a webinar with Q&A whenever a new competition is launched, and now it's going to be even more exciting, more interesting to see those notices of competition. All the questions that I couldn't answer right now, we're going to do a memo. It might take a couple of days or so, but we're going to put that out freely, widely in all the social media groups and our website. So watch for that. And I myself or my colleagues will answer every single one of those questions. I see we're at number 29, some of which I've answered, but many are still open. With that, thank you so much. A huge thank you to Jesse, who's in the room with me, and he was doing all the tricks in the back. And another gigantic thank you to Rita and Agi, who were extremely, extremely helpful in putting this together on very short notice. So I really appreciate your help, and obviously to Ticiana, who made herself available. So big thank you, and wishing you good luck. Everyone, please share the news, the information, the recording, all of that with anyone who you think is interested, so they can get into the EU and pursue a wonderful EU career. So with that, thanks so much. Get in touch with us. All our platform contact details are there. And with this, we'll sign off from Brussels. Thanks, and have a nice day.
Bye-bye.